Hello, Week Unwrappers. Now, look, I know you've just pressed play because you want to be treated to the Week Unwrapped in your ears. But imagine if your eyes could see it as well. Well, on the 7th of April, that could be made a reality. You could come and watch a recording of an episode of the Week Unwrapped at Podcast Live. Find full details at podcastlive.com. It's the week ending Saturday the 30th of March, and this is the Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Theresa May announcing that she will resign before the next phase of Brexit negotiations, officials in New York State banning unvaccinated children from public spaces, and a survey showing that a quarter of British adults lose sleep over debt. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Gillie, Arion McNicoll, and Cameron Tait. Rebecca, you get to start the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The Pope has rejected the one ring to rule them all.
I'm sure being denied kissing the ring in that situation is uncomfortable, especially since you're on camera and the Pope is doing it not like in a subtle way, but in a very jolted way. And again, this just comes back to a degradation of the Petrine ministry, which is very sad to see. So let us redouble our penances. Let us pray the rosary for the Pope. Let us fast for the Pope. We must pray for the Pope, and we must pray for a full restoration of the beauty and the glories of Catholic Christianity.
Catholic author Dr. Taylor Marshall on YouTube on the breaking of a papal tradition. Rebecca, what happened this week?
So this week, a video went viral of the Pope Francis, at a shrine in Italy. He was greeting monks, nuns, and lay people, and some of them were trying to kiss his ring, which is a tradition in the papacy, and he was jerking his hand away in a very slightly obvious and embarrassing for them manner.
I mean, thank you for flagging this up because, you say the video went viral. A lot of us have had our minds on other current affairs news this week. I did miss it, and thank you for the lols. This is proper slapstick, isn't it? People go in for the hand, he withdraws it just at the last second.
One of them ends up kissing their own hand.
It's just like, if you've waited perhaps 8 decades to meet the Pope, you don't want that to be the thing caught on camera, do you?
Yeah, it does make for uncomfortable viewing, and it's funny you should say about how, yes, it did go under the radar probably for many people. Where it really went viral was Catholic Twitter, which is quite a big subset of Twitter. In the Catholic kind of blogosphere, media sphere, this has been a big story, and the reason kind of goes beyond the actual, the ring itself and the tradition, and kind of speaks more to this big divide in the church between the traditionalists and the progressive wing, as far as progressive as the Catholic Church gets, which is kind of represented by Pope Francis.
But hold on just a minute. Cameron Tait. I thought, given the relative controversy of the previous Pope, who abdicated but is still with us, Pope Francis was seen amongst Catholics as generally a good thing.
Well, I think it's generally a little bit of a divide. I think most, perhaps younger Catholics are seeing him as quite a forward-thinking person, whereas maybe some of your older generation are seeing this as being a tradition that's broken. However, in this instance, digging into it a little bit deeper, apparently insiders are saying that he was merely just trying to save time and that people were actually kissing his ring for 10 minutes, but he had so many people to see.
Not one person for 10 minutes.
Not one person for 10 minutes. No, he wasn't going to town on it. But no, apparently it was after 10 minutes he had to do other things, so he started moving his hand away. So people are saying that they're maybe reading a little bit too much into it.
But the rules aren't clear, are they, Arion? That's the problem, and a lot of the criticism that's levelled at the Pope is that he sort of says one thing, like there should be more female clergy, but then doesn't do anything about it. And on this as well, he says, I'm very progressive. That would be consistent with withdrawing his ring finger and not letting people kiss it. And yet he hasn't made a rule about it, so people are in a position where, okay, his hand's there, do I kiss it or not?
I think the problem is for Francis, as it has ever been for popes, that they're always wrestling with different attitudes within the church, and Francis has arrived at this time where he's inherited a church that was, still in a very traditional conservative state, and he has been involved in trying to liberalise it. But the liberalisation moves that he's been undertaking are things that are going to take time, and you have to do them gently, and certain things you can't even say out loud because they'd be too radical to just say, well, no more kissing the ring. Great wings of the church would be like, well, you can't do that anymore. It's too bound up in history.
But surely if anyone can do it, the Pope can do it. I mean, isn't that basically Catholic doctrine?
Well, this is the thing, that this is what's been really interesting about Pope Francis's papacy, is that an unprecedented amount of pushback, not just from Catholic media, but also from clergy and high-ranking ones as well. There was a leaked document last year which suggested that some cardinals were pushing for the Pope to resign, basically saying he brought the church to the brink of heresy. The way that Francis has differed a lot, particularly from John Paul II, was that John Paul was very focused on doctrine and sticking strictly to the doctrine, basically installing high-ranking officials who would basically justify the church's position on things like sexuality, abortion, contraception, whereas Francis has tried to move to a more kind of pastoral role and basically minimizing emphasis on the church's ideology and saying, how do we show love to people, how do we bring more people to the church, which for some cardinals and for some clergy that sets off alarm bells, that he's saying actually the doctrine of the Catholic Church doesn't really matter that much, which to them is heresy.
And part of the problem as well is the fact that we have this unprecedented existence of two popes at the same time. You've got Pope Benedict, who's now the Pope Emeritus, and
ready to have his ring kissed at any moment.
Ready to have his ring kissed if he could just get his fingers back on the ring. And then you have Pope Francis, and each of them does represent one or other side of the church. And Benedict was into a smaller, more conservative, more traditional church, and Francis has tried to be more progressive and opening up of the church to try to bring back people into the fold who otherwise had fallen out. For example, those American Catholics who have got divorced and are not allowed to be Catholics anymore.
Again, what you find with usually these things is Francis, when he does make a statement, it's something that he's very open about. It's a big announcement. Whereas something like this, if he wasn't keen on people kissing his ring anymore, do you think he would do it quite as ham-fisted as literally pulling his hand away while people are trying to do it? I think if it was something that he was really trying to change, he would have made a statement about it.
Can we just get crash course on ring kissing, please, Rebecca? How much is this a staple of Catholic tradition? Because it strikes me something that possibly could be more recent than the Catholic Church.
Well, it has been a tradition for a long time. For hundreds of years, it's been customary. So the Pope wears a ring. Well, the Pope always wears a ring, but there's a special ring called the fisherman's ring, because of St. Peter, the first Pope, who was a fisherman, which Francis only wears on special occasions. It's been tradition for hundreds of years for Catholics to kiss the ring, not only of the Pope, but also of bishops.
But hundreds of years is not that much.
No, not really. And of course, it's not in the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible about it. And it's not officially part of the church doctrine. It's just a tradition. And this is one of many traditions that Pope Francis has departed from. He does not wear the papal tiara. I
can't believe you're laughing at papal tiara. We've said ring kissing like 4 times.
He, drives a Fiat. He doesn't live in the papal apartments. He lives in.
He's chauffeured around in a Fiat, to be fair.
And
yes,
Lamborghini did give him a supercar as well. He's just not chosen to drive it.
He's chosen not to race it around the streets of the Vatican. And this is just one of many examples of Vatican pomp that he has declined to participate in. And this is because he is from the Jesuit tradition, which emphasises modesty and poverty, and he's the first Jesuit pope. So it does put him at odds with a large amount of the church who believe in this pomp and circumstance.
Okay. But why is it your moment of the week then, if it's something that you can say, well, this is the kind of thing Francis does all the time?
I think the important thing about this is that it is a manufactured controversy. As Cam was saying earlier, if you watch the whole video, this was clearly about time saving, not about Pope Francis saying that he disapproves of the tradition of kissing the ring. And all of the senior Catholic journalists, clergy that have seized on this know that. They know that this is not Pope Francis spitting in the face of tradition, and I think it's important because they have seized on this moment as yet another opportunity to publicly lambast the Pope in a way that I don't think would have been acceptable in the past, especially under, even under John Paul II or Benedict XVI. They did come in for criticism, but definitely not so much from their own church.
And I think that's a really significant point, because the conservatives who are calling for Pope Francis to stand down are not just talking about it because of his ring-kissing antics or the clothes that he wears, but it's the things that he says and the pronouncements that he makes and the direction that he wants to take the church. And they're very serious about it, the pressure that they're putting him under. Some conservatives want to declare Francis an anti-pope. There were 40 anti-popes between the 3rd and 15th centuries of these popes or people claiming to be pope who gathered significant followings. But it hasn't happened more recently.
They're only declared anti-pope presumably after they've died.
Well, Well, by the Pope who ends up triumphing, I guess.
Right.
But you do have this growing tension between these two extant popes who are there at the same time. And so from the conservative perspective, Benedict is the right and true pope, and Francis is some false pretender.
I would say that with Francis's kind of pragmatic approach to Catholicism, while it's causing a lot of controversy now, let's say when we get the next pope in, if we went back to a more conservative approach, do you not think it could have a huge and detrimental impact on the Catholic Church?
Absolutely, and this is one of the things that that I've been reading, is that whereas under John Paul II there was a lot of emphasis on pronouncing judgment on sexuality, family life, contraception, etc., the Catholic Church since then, since the explosion of the abuse scandals, the Catholic Church has lost so much moral currency on those subjects that any future attempts to return to these things as being like the central tenets of a papacy is probably going to alienate masses and masses of loyal Catholics.
And yet Francis's efforts to bring, say, divorcees back into the fold are contentious, because if they went through, it would open up the idea that the church has been ruling incorrectly on something that Jesus said for thousands of years. And so actually, to allow for his doctrines to go unquestioned, it's almost, you can understand why the conservative elements of the church want to limit some of the moves that he's making.
Or it could have just gone viral because it is a funny video.
That's possible.
I think it's a bit like when the Queen does a smackdown to a royal reporter and they ask a stupid question and she says, well, obviously. It's just like that, I think. Anyway, Cameron, you're up next after this. Cameron, it's your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
It's a case of 8 steps forward, 1 giant leap back.
There are many risks associated with increasing speed. There's safety, there's increase in pollution, increase in petrol usage, and interestingly enough, because of reduced travel times, we believe that people will choose to travel further. And that in itself will increase the exposure to risk and the number of accidents. So far as safety is concerned, increasing speed almost always leads to increase in casualties.
That was Professor Ben Haydecker from University College London's Transport Studies on the potential change in the UK's speed limits, which, Cameron, many of us will have read about on the front pages of the tabloids. Why are you bringing front page news to the table? That is not how we roll.
Because in true journalism fashion, I've dug a little deeper into this story, and there's a lot more to it than you've seen. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn a negative news story into a positive one.
Okay, so the negative news story was what? The car's going to stop me driving over 70 miles an hour and I'm outraged?
Essentially so, yes. So the EU is introducing a host of new laws for cars that will come into effect possibly from 2022, providing that it gets the green light. One of those, and it's the ones that you'll be seeing on your tabloid papers, is that all cars will be fitted with a mandatory speed limiter, which has got people very angry because it means that they can't break the law. Yeah, and we quite enjoy breaking the law. But there were many other aspects to it that are actually really, really good and will have a massive impact on the motoring industry.
Tell us more, oh journalist.
Well, I'm glad you asked. Basically, there were 15 laws that are coming into effect, 9 of which are going to be for production cars, and one of them is the speed limiter. So of the 8 others, you're going to get things like autonomous emergency braking. So when let's say a car in front of you slams the brakes on, your car will react to that immediately, usually faster than your brain would be able to. So you'll have that included as standard. You won't have to pay for it. And you also have things like breathalyzers fitted to every car as standard.
Talk us through that, because there's been some talk when people were talking about breathalyzers being fitted that the car engine wouldn't start if you'd had too many drinks. Is it more a case of just you being able to monitor it?
It's being able to monitor it rather than, you would have to literally blow into the car for it to start. But no, that would be for monitoring your level of alcohol, which I believe is actually part of cars. If you take your car to France, you have to have a breathalyzer on your car anyway. So it's all really important things that will have really, really positive impact on the motoring industry.
Or will they, team? Because
it was a good story.
Actually, I personally saw this news of the speed limiting as a positive, obvious safety feature. This idea of autonomous braking when someone steps out in front of my car, I'm not sure that is a safety feature for me. If someone's going too fast behind me and then they slam in the back of me and give me spinal injuries, it takes away my choice to maybe not stop at that last minute.
I agree, and there's also, we're told that you're meant to drive straight over animals that wander onto the road, say, because it's more unsafe in certain circumstances to brake or try to maneuver around them. And, it does raise those questions about whether cars are going to be braking in ways that are going to be problematic rather than helpful. I agree. I think that the business of having cars that can't go over the speed limit does seem like a fairly sensible idea. But I suppose if you're one of those people who thinks that a person being in charge of an automobile is the safest way for an automobile to run, which is kind of contrary to the direction that the industry is going at the moment, then you're going to want as much control as possible.
And that's what it comes down to, isn't it, Rebecca? It's the Catholic Church writ into the automobile industry, isn't it? There's a tension between the progressives and the conservatives.
Yeah, I think there is there's a technological divide. From my perspective, it reminds me of, if you remember the other week when Donald Trump was talking about the Boeing 737 crash in Ethiopia, and he said that modern planes had got too complicated. He received a lot of flack for that. But I think there was actually some truth to that, and it reminds me of this in a way, in that for every new safety feature that's brought in, the driver needs to be able to know how to react if there is a problem with that safety feature. If you come to rely on these features, but you also need to know what to do if they stop working or if they work in an incorrect way. Cam has already said to us before about he drove a car which is supposed to have technology that keeps you in your lane. If you start to drift, it pulls you back in. But he was saying if the lines aren't painted firmly enough that it can confuse the sensors. So this actually is putting more responsibility on the driver, that they have to learn how to react and react quickly in the moment if there is a problem with these new features.
Thank you for reminding me, Rebecca, that Cameron has previously criticised that safety feature, because that, yes, Cameron, is one of the ones that you're now praising, isn't it?
Well, I'm not praising it. So yes, I have been in a car that it had something called lane keep assistance, where you're driving along and it'll ensure that if your car is drifting over the white line, it gently nudges at the steering wheel so you're back in the centre of the lane. But when I was in rural England driving a semi-autonomous car, it was tugging at the wheel and quite literally trying to drive me off the road. So that will become mandatory on all cars in 2022. That's nice, isn't it? So things like, I just want to go back to emergency braking. It really is a very good system. I know that you think it isn't, but if you have someone that walks out in front of the road and you're not paying attention, your car will try to do its very best to stop and not hit them.
Right, but what about my point that then the truck goes in the back of you and kills you?
Well, this actually applies to trucks as well. So they will be getting...
No, but that only works if all the cars are autonomous.
Yes, but if someone walks in front of your car,
yeah,
and you've spotted it and you slam the brakes on, and the truck behind you is not paying attention,
I agree.
In either case, it's going to happen.
But I'm not outlining that scenario. I'm outlining the scenario where someone's walking their dog.
Yes.
The dog at the last minute runs in front of their car, and in a split second, I decide, unfortunately, I'm going to kill the dog rather than die.
Yes.
Your car will choose not to kill the dog, and you will die. That's my point.
It's true. Yeah.
Great. Well, that's a legitimate concern then, is it not?
The risk that Cam's prepared to accept.
Trying so hard to bring a good news story and you're ruining it for me.
There is another aspect of it that is quite positive, to bring back to positivity. Theo Leggett, writing for the BBC about this, was saying that the real story, rather than the speed limiter, which just kind of grabbed the headlines, is that all cars will be fitted with mandatory black box technology. So they're going to be recording everything that you do in the car. So this is going to potentially revolutionise people's experience with car insurance, because it's no longer going to be your word against essentially nobody's. If nobody sees you speeding or breaking the law in some other way, they can't prove that you have. Whereas this way, if you get into an accident and you say, no, I don't think I was driving over the limit, all they have to do is read that data and they know everything that you've been doing.
I mean, actually, isn't the tension, we were talking about progressives and conservatives, but actually the tension, Cameron, is it Jeremy Clarkson's fault, basically? Like, if you're a petrol head, if you're a Top Gear fan, if you're someone who likes cars, that's sort of been elided, it seems to me, in the public imagination with a kind of libertarian, I want to do whatever I want vibe, whereas the two things don't have to go together. You can enjoy driving and think, I want to obey the law.
Yes, 100%. I'm just as happy cruising along the motorway in some quiet electric car as I am hooning around a track in a supercar.
Good use of the word hooning.
Thank you. But so if you were to bring it to the speed limits, let's say, if you had everything that was fixed, no one was going above 70 miles an hour, you would have this kind of A, you would get a build-up of traffic because no one would be able to overtake. And B, you would have these kind of cars that would be kind of gradually overtaking each other incredibly slowly. And you'd also have this drowsiness that would come in because you're not really paying attention. Your car is just pretty much doing everything for you. You're just steering and keeping your foot planted on the floor. So there is this, yes, there's that kind of idea of it's libertarian. You have control of your car and we all want freedom. But there are practical reasons to it as well. You want to be in control of your car.
But I think also people have this natural aversion to whatever new technology comes along. And when seatbelts came in and they were mandatory, people didn't want to do their seatbelts up. And looking even further back, when traffic lights were introduced around the beginning of the 20th century, people just thought it was madness that people would stop their cars willingly when this light changed up above you. You know, it just sounded like a batty system that wouldn't work. Of course, we know it does work. And I think that that's the thing, that we need to see these technologies in action before we can make a call on whether they're going to be, whether they're going to work for us or not.
Well, they're already in existence. They're already used on production cars, but a lot of them come at the cost of you have to pay maybe a few £100, maybe a few £1,000 to have them fitted. So there is a chance that they could add value onto really cheap cars, because every car would have to have this on if it gets the green light.
Okay, and you mentioned, what was it, 7 things that hadn't received the attention of the speed limiting headline? 8. You gave us a précis of a few of the slightly sexier ones. Give us a really deeply unglamorous one that listeners to this podcast can impress their friends with.
There's a drowsiness sensor.
Go on.
So if you're driving and it senses you're drowsy, it'll give you a little flashing to say, you're a bit drowsy, wake up.
It'll commandeer your Apple CarPlay to put the week unwrapped on. One last story to come after this. And so finally this week, it's Arion's turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This week, Britain had all the feels.
If at any time at the end of the transition period, the Union or the United Kingdom consider that the protocol is, in whole or in part, no longer necessary to achieve the objectives set out in Article 1, brackets 3, and should cease to apply, in whole or in part, it may notify the other party, setting out its reasons. Well, I don't know about you, but Brexit makes me very hungry. Luckily, I've been to the supermarket.
That was BBC Brussels reporter Adam Fleming, not living up to his name there, whispering beautifully the Brexit withdrawal statement and eating a croissant. And there are so many questions that I could ask Arion, not least why have you chosen this as your story of the week? Why was he doing it in the first place?
It's very important. No, I think this is a really interesting story. Adam Fleming was it was a bit of a joke, really. He was riffing on the important news of this week that we're not discussing, but doing so by making a video that was meant to stimulate people who have a response to this thing called ASMR, which is Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response. And partially it was a joke because he was trying to make something unpalatable a little bit more palatable. You know, MPs really haven't taken to this withdrawal agreement terribly kindly, and he was sort of trying to inject something that was going to make people feel a little bit more positive about it. But it coincided with this fascinating article by Rebecca Seal this week in the FT about the rise and rise of ASMR and how it's now the 5th most searched for term on YouTube.
And this is, Rebecca, people seeking out videos of, for example, ladies' mouths slurping on salmon fillets, or someone sucking on honeycomb.
Well, you don't have to say it like that. I can tell from your tone how you feel about this whole phenomenon.
I'm merely reporting the facts. Well, no, I'm not. I did watch the honeycomb one on the train on the way here, and it made me feel sick. I don't know what people get off on this.
Yeah,
apparently.
that's not the response that it's designed to provoke.
Why would you want to listen to someone eating? It's so weird.
Well, I think most of us can probably identify to a certain degree with the principle of ASMR, which is that certain sounds can kind of stimulate like a pleasant feeling.
Yes.
Like sometimes, you know, you might even smell something. It doesn't necessarily have to be auditory, but I think that's the most common form. And you get like a pleasant, like tingly sensation, like on your scalp or down your spine or something. And
the opening of a can of beer.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's more of a Pavlovian response. So that's like the basic principle of it. But this kind of industry, you may as well call it, because the successful YouTubers make scads of money off of it. You know, it's become this massive industry of videos of people not only talking and whispering, but also crinkling things or like opening things or making specific noises that have been shown to stimulate this response in people who have it in them.
Do you have it in you, Cameron?
Well, it's funny because listening to that there, no, I don't particularly enjoy that. In fact, it made me feel really quite uncomfortable. It's nothing that he's saying. It's just that, I don't know, what it's the tone of what it is. It sends a shiver down my spine in the wrong way. However, ASMR is a really broadly used term at the moment, whereas there's only actually a few ways of doing it properly. The best way you should do it is you just have really high quality recording equipment and a high quality pair of headphones. So if you listen to that on, let's say, some generic earphones that came with your mobile phone, it probably wouldn't do much for you. But if you had a proper set of headphones, you might pick something up that is being recorded.
And is the feeling a bit like, the only thing I can think of that I can relate to with this is when I was a kid in the barbers and they'd use clippers on the back of your head, and that zzz coming right up close to your ear always used to make me shudder. I wouldn't call that like a spine-tingling pleasure. It was really horrible, but I can identify that feeling of a noise making you feel anxious. Is it that?
Yeah, in the early days of people trying to describe what the feeling was, it was described as like a sort of brain orgasm, or it was there were these sexual terms that were applied to it. But increasingly, people are moving away from that because it actually isn't apparently a sexual sensation. It's more akin to deep relaxation in conjunction with a kind of some sort of brain fireworks. There's some sort of tingling that people report, and then they feel deeply relaxed after they've had the experience. So that's what it's meant to be. But interestingly, that clip that we heard at the top triggered two people on our team when we circulated it within the team.
Name and shame.
Who it turns out have ASMR response. Both Felicity Capon and John Stepek, who you heard last week, both said, having never known that they were ASMR respondent in the past, both said that this set them off. So actually, the equipment was evidently high quality enough, and he did it right to trigger that response in people who have it.
So that's the fascinating thing about internet culture, isn't it? Is that this thing that other people would have previously thought was possibly even to go as far as to call it their dirty secret, but even if you don't want to use a pejorative word around it, that thought there was something unique to them, they now realise is something that perhaps, I don't know, 1 in 8, 1 in 9 people also identify with.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that it's the 5th most searched term on YouTube, I think, is very significant. And I think that, yeah, as you're saying, it's a really good example of the way that the internet has destigmatised things, that it's really liberated people to go out and find pleasure, sexual or otherwise, in whatever form, brings them joy, without being made to feel like they're the only person who feels that way. I mean, they're clearly not, because this ASMR community is massive. And it's just one of the ways that the internet has brought these niche communities together. Although I think there is still some stigma, as Arion was saying, the push to move away from sexualized terms. There are obviously a large subset of practitioners who don't want to be associated with, they don't want it to be seen as a sexual thing or a fetish, and also the performers don't necessarily want to be seen as sex workers in that respect. But of course there is a subset of people who are obviously getting an erotic kick out of it. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the most famous and watched practitioners are young women, looking intently into the camera, often often relatively attractive. There is definitely a sexual element, but that's certainly not what's driving necessarily the majority of listeners.
And I do wonder, therefore, whether it's a bit like my instinctive reaction, genuinely, and I didn't mean to be offensive to anyone who is ASMR reactive who's listening, was, it's a bit weird. But I suppose someone sitting here 10 years ago might have said that about subdom sexual fetishes, or they might have said that about people who are into transgender sexuality depicted on the internet. And both of those things now seem pretty mainstream because of 50 Shades of Grey and the conversation around gender fluidity. So maybe ASMR is the next thing that will be, completely mainstream.
I think that's right. And if you look back to something like synesthesia, which up until really recently wasn't understood at all, that's the experience of hearing colours or seeing tastes, cross-experiencing sensations across senses. And that wasn't understood until very recently. And we really are at the foothills of understanding more about what ASMR is all about. And I think that's why the sort of mainstreaming of it that we saw this week in this clip is really interesting, because it opens up the opportunity for people to look at it in more detail. And just now we are starting to see proper scientific inquiry into it.
I think that's really a really important part of it as well, is that the internet is such a powerful platform for a group of people to get together and really demand that the scientific establishment pays attention to a real phenomenon.
And I suppose also there's the potential abuse of consumers by advertisers. I mean, this is an audience that are incredibly focused. If you whisper the brand in their ear, is that something that can be abused?
Absolutely. And coinciding with this year's Super Bowl, which is the biggest advertising moment that there is in the American TV calendar, an ASMR stimulating ad was released starring Zoe Kravitz, who did a bunch of things that were properly worked out in accordance with people who experience ASMR, that the ad actually did trigger things correctly. So, and it was a beer ad, and it was her sitting in a forest, and I think you're absolutely right that it's, this is us seeing the very beginnings of the kinds of commercial exploitation that we're likely to get further with this sensation.
So I wonder if that might be banned in the future, Rebecca. A bit like subliminal messaging. Yeah.
I mean, it only affects a minority of people, so I don't think advertisers are necessarily going to see this as the way forward. But it's definitely a sign of how brands are going out of their way to harness these niche communities and just find new ways to exploit people's natural sensations in the pursuit of money.
So if none of us are ASMR susceptible, what does make our spines shiver? Nails down blackboards, that kind of thing?
Or shiver. I have had a reaction to an ASMR piece, sound, video, I don't know what you would call it, of someone like scratching the microphone.
Yeah.
I found that quite pleasing.
Do that for us now.
I definitely get that fingers down the blackboard thing in the most negative way possible. It's really nasty. And even the idea of writing with chalk on a chalkboard, I really don't like that. Chewing on fabric, does anyone get that?
But is that one that makes you feel bad or good?
Yeah, I feel weird. Very
okay,
weird.
yeah. What about good, though?
Nauseous.
Like Buddhist sort of gong type stuff? That's a classic one, isn't it? Chimes.
I get like serious tingle down one side of my face when I watch the closing scene of the 1994 version of Little Women starring Winona Ryder.
That is just like everything you say so weirdly specific that it's adorable.
The dialogue gives me like a weird tingle, but it's weird because there's like plenty of romantic scenes in film. I think it's because I love the book so much that it's like literally ingrained in my physical response now.
Okay, well, if any literary rom-coms from the 90s have left you semi-paralysed, please do let us know. I'd be fascinated to know if Rebecca is alone on that one or whether we've discovered a new internet sub-niche. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Cameron Tait, Rebecca Gillie and Arion McNicoll. Make sure you are up to date with all our episodes by subscribing to this show, The Week Unwrapped, on your podcast app of choice. And don't forget, you can hear what all this sounds like when it hasn't been edited by coming to Podcast Live on the 7th of April. Full details at podcastlive.com. And for that reason, because we're recording a live episode next Sunday, next week's episode will be a few days later than usual. So be there to see it live. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Chica Ayres at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.